Why don't we get started? So this talk is Decentralization for Security and Freedom, a discussion of asymmetric and decentralized technologies, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to go through first some introductions for us. We're going to kind of problematize, like identify the problem that we're trying to deal with here. Talk about how some of the approaches that we use in information security in a professional context, right? So like an industry context, probably aren't specifically suited for this specific problem set. And propose a philosophical or conceptual approach, a kind of framework for thinking through how we can actually start to contribute to solutions to this kind of a problem, right? And then, of course, we're going to do the obligatory tool drop, right? We wrote a script that's proof of concept for maybe an approach to this, and link it up to our Git. But yeah, so my name is Tom. I'm from a group called the Digital Freedom Initiative. We're a local organization in Cleveland affiliated with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We've been handing out flyers for crypto parties and stuff all day. But yeah, we're sort of a new organization. This is kind of our first big public thing. A little bit about myself. I am a rogue, former philosophy professor. Then I did threat intelligence for a little bit. Now I work as an application pen tester. It's been kind of a long, circuitous route, for the last, 6 or 7 years of my life to where I am now. I've always been relatively passionate about digital rights, going back to the late 90s. As one of those internet generation kids, being able to see the promises of the internet even back in the days when everything was static HTML pages and static links pre, Wikipedia and all this other kind of stuff. You could even see it then, right? I've been very passionate about that. And over maybe the last 4 or 5 years, I've become a total nerd for security stuff. Largely because it's just cool, right? Security stuff is cool. And Chris Nickerson said it, what was it, 2 BSides ago? Where a lot of us in this room are lucky because we get to do our hobby for a job, right? And that's one of the things I love about this industry.
Jump in real quick, James? Yeah. So I'm James. I'm also with the Digital Freedom Initiative, and by trade, I'm a software developer, and by night, I do DevOps stuff. More on that a little bit later. And I'm also interested in security and digital privacy, and have been for the last 6 years.
So, okay, the problem, right? And I think it's a problem that gets alluded to a lot, kind of in conversations, but we haven't really attempted to deal with it sort of in a frontal way, right? We haven't attempted to really dive into this problem, but the problem revolves around a very basic issue of the internet, right? That the modern internet is a paradox. That on the one hand, we've been handed a tool, which is probably the most important tool that humans have been able to construct since the printing press, right? If we think back in time, the printing press was the tool that created the Protestant Reformation. Right? It was the tool that created the American Revolution. It was the tool that created the French Revolution. It's a tool that has facilitated social and political change ever since its inception and popularization. Since the advent of the internet, we have seen a very similar thing happen, right? We've seen repressive regimes fall in the Middle East, right? Not always with the best of outcomes, but we've seen it happen. We've seen people do things that they were never able to do before. And that's been a capability that has been developing slowly for the last 15 years or so. Right? So we have this incredible tool, and this tool carries with it an absolutely profound promise all the time, every time we log on. But at the same time, the internet's been constructed in such a way as to centralize control over communications and to engage in unprecedented levels of surveillance, right? We were just having a conversation about this on the back table before this presentation, about how within the United States, we don't deal with, at least until net neutrality goes away, we don't deal with the same kinds of problems of having connections throttled and cut that you see in a place like Turkey or India or China or something like that. What we deal with is a very different sort of problem set, right? We deal with a problem set that revolves around the personal limitations that we place on ourselves because we're concerned about who's watching what we're saying, right? And that has created a situation which this tool all of a sudden becomes something that we use with hesitancy, right? That we don't use in the way that we possibly could. That the dream of the internet was a dream that was of a network that was horizontal and dynamic, right? And this wasn't necessarily the dream of the architects, but this was the dream that came into being in the 1970s, right? And formed the basis of organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation. This idea that we were going to have this thing that could make us into different kinds of people, that had access to more information, that had access to communication tools that we never had before. However, due to the origins of the internet and the reliance on already existing telecommunications companies to form the backbone of that network, the dream has become disrupted and complicated, right? That instead, this vision sort of exists alongside a vision of the internet as a centralized mechanism for commerce and surveillance, not necessarily one purely for expression. That the internet is controlled by a very small number of entities, and none of them can be trusted. And we see this as a problem here. But when you talk to people in places like Turkey, or in places like Senegal, or in places like Nigeria, or China, or Vietnam, that problem is so much more apparent to them. And the thing that I always hear when I talk to people from those places is we have to be mindful, we have to be vigilant, we have to be cautious, right? That it's not that the mechanisms don't exist in the United States to have the same kind of controls. It's that they just haven't been weaponized yet. That's one of those things that's at stake in the discussion around net neutrality, right? Is this idea that all of a sudden the ISP, which controls the actual lines our communications go over, have the ability to limit our access to certain assets, not necessarily by banning them, but by throttling their connections down to a point where it's impractical to get to them, right? And that's the first time that we've really been dealing with that specific sort of problem. So this can be easily demonstrated in a myriad of cases, right? This kind of problem set. Where large service providers have handed information over to repressive regimes and ISPs have colluded with repressive governments, right? And stories like this kind of circulate around the internet all the time. We can also see the impacts of this in places like Turkey, India, China, Syria, and so on, right? We were having a conversation on the back table earlier about Blue Coat, right? And the use of Blue Coat appliances in Syria to do deep packet inspection. And we've also seen this in situations where service providers have been complicit in surveillance and throttling or cutting off connectivity to whole regions, websites, things like this. But this is not only a problem with foreign regimes and providers, right? That there's a long history of AT&T working with the NSA, as well as companies like Blue Coat, right, which I already mentioned, selling deep packet inspection gear to Syria and Turkey, which is then used for repression and in some cases has been the deciding factor in raiding someone's house, throwing them in prison, and torturing them, right? Then in the midst of these challenges, encryption, anonymity, and the control over services that we interact with has become a project of many developers and people within the information security community, right? That this has led to an explosion of tools that attempt to preserve or expand the ability of people to communicate privately. That increasingly these tools are becoming easier to use for the average user, right? So how many people here used Tor, say, before 2007? Right, I did. Does anyone remember having to configure your circuits manually? Right? Then you had to like set your proxy settings. It was really easy to screw up, right? But now there's Tor browser, and like anyone can just like go download the executable and like or whatever and just run it. Signal is the same way, right? Signal's incredible because all you do is download the app, configure it, and all of a sudden you're encrypting your text messages. It's easy, right? And there's been a lot of work kind of pushing in this direction. You know, again, primary examples of this are Signal and Tor. But for as great as a lot of these tools are, they sort of present a central problem, right? And a problem that's relatively common amongst these tools at this point. So in both Signal and Tor, but also VPNs, and many other of the technologies that have been utilized in order to preserve communications privacy, we run into a similar problem, right? That to the degree that these systems remain technically complex to run rather than use, so even running a Tor exit node can be complicated, especially legally, right? Running a Signal server, I mean, like the software's out there, but there's no documentation, let alone a lot of the other more complex protocols. To the degree that these become technically complicated to run rather than use, we end up with a large amount of users trusting a small amount of anonymous-ish operators and some dude named Moxie Marlinspike, right? Who's got dreadlocks and like, you know, talks in metaphor a lot of times. He was like a chill dude, but not a lot of people actually know him as a person, right? And that creates a problem. That the problem with Tor is that it's based on a technology-based trust model rather than an interpersonal one, right? That what we're doing is we're constructing a synthetic network that people are relying on for their safety and freedom, right? That even though no single entity can know the totality of information about a connection, those that run exit nodes do still hold a significant amount of control over the safety of the content one is accessing and the ability to monitor usage, right? That this is mitigated somewhat by the use of hidden services which remain within the network, and do not utilize exit nodes for communication, but other risks also still exist within that context, right? That with the risks of running exit nodes being widely known, the number of willing operators is very small. Like, I don't know how familiar are people with the kind of legal risks of running exit nodes, right? You get letters, cease and desist letters constantly. People try and sue you because it's your IP address that people are like pirating content off of or like hacking things like this. So the number of operators of exit nodes are incredibly small, like very, very small. And people that operate exit nodes, as has been demonstrated by some studies where people have been actually sort of querying exit nodes to see if they're tracking traffic and things like this, the privacy of users is not always the primary concern, right? Most exit nodes are fine, but malicious exit nodes have very much been found within the Tor network. Signal, just like Tor, sort of relies on the trust that we have in anonymous service providers within a centralized messaging network. That even if we can audit the code base for the client and the server, right, which you very much can for Signal, the server code is partial, right? So not everything's there. And there's a statement up on the Open Whisper system site as to why that's the case. And the implementation of parallel signal networks is difficult, if not radically impossible, right? Like, you can't communicate with people on other signal networks if you set up a parallel network. Though the concept of ratcheting Diffie-Hellman key exchanges holds a significant amount of promise, and it really, really does. It's a really interesting protocol. There is the option of verifying key changes in person. Like, has anyone ever tried to verify a Signal key change in person? Like, I've done it. It involves like scanning QR codes on each other's phones, right? That even though you can do that, in practicality, long distance communication makes this difficult, if not impossible, to sort of implement, right? So therefore, we have to trust the cryptography, as well as the claim to not store data by the provider, right? And the integrity of the key held by a likely remote other user, right? Someone that we may or may not actually be in direct communication with. That within all of this, we are still able to be identified by the simple fact that Signal requires a phone number to register. And it is more and more difficult to obtain clean, anonymous burner phones or sign up for things like Google Voice without giving any sort of identifiable information. That since the discussion of ISP data collection that happened earlier this year, right, the use of VPNs has even risen dramatically. Like, all over the internet on the little clickbaity sites, like you see it on BuzzFeed and everything else, everyone's talking about, like, how do you identify good VPNs and these kinds of things. But all of these providers, regardless of whether you trust them or not, like AirVPN is pretty good, and, you know, like NordVPN is pretty cool. They all suffer from the same flaw, which, just like Signal and Tor, we have to rely on the integrity of an anonymous third party. VPN providers are also increasingly difficult to evaluate, right? Like, incredibly difficult to evaluate. Then unless you run your own, which, I don't know, many people have tried to run their own VPN, but now with Streisand and Algo and things like this, it's a lot easier to do that than it used to be in the past. But unless you run your own, it becomes impossible to have assurances of actual privacy. That for dissidents, journalists, and radicals, this could be an issue of life and death. And VPN providers have turned information over to regimes which has resulted in arrests and, on at least one occasion, the torture and death of a dissident. And this happened in Syria. So we also have an additional problem, right? And that additional problem is a problem that within information security discourse we don't often deal with, right? Which is a non-technical problem. It's not one that has to do with code and computers and processing power and things like this. And that problem is that those that are the most at risk are often not very well resourced or technically savvy, right? Has anyone read Glenn Greenwald's book about the Edward Snowden leaks? You know, there was, right? It was pretty good. It was a good book, right? Really good. Yeah, there was a half a chapter to an entire chapter. I forget how many pages, just about the process of Edward Snowden convincing Glenn Greenwald to use PGP. And the process of training him how to do that. And to use, like, you know, Pigeon and OTR, right? And things like this, because even though this is a guy who writes about national security issues, he had no idea how to do this stuff, right? And so the people that are often the most at risk are the people that don't have the resources or the time or the technical knowledge to be able to utilize a lot of the technologies that we put out in the most effective way possible, right? The solutions that many of us help to architect and test at our day jobs are not applicable in this kind of a context, right? And we'll get into this a little bit more, but a lot of us work at relatively large corporations, right, with a lot of resources and firewalls and security monitoring teams and like all these other things, right? And that's not technically feasible for even Amnesty International, let alone your small grassroots organization. That activists, dissidents, radicals, and journalists and so on do not have the capacity to build and run persistent, well-protected systems on enterprise-grade hardware, behind enterprise-grade firewalls, and run a SIM to monitor it all, right? It'd be awesome if they did, but that takes entire staffs to do. That outside of the excellent work that many of us do each day and every day, the discourse around information security must address the problem of high-risk non-enterprise users more effectively, right? We put these things out all the time. We release white papers, we do all these things, and they're great, right? And they lead to approaches that we can use in this kind of a context. But we tend to hang out with each other, right? We tend to circulate around other technical people and talk in a specific lingo, and haven't actually been effective for as much as many of us have tried in communicating outside of those circles as well as we probably should. That this takes rethinking the way that services are run, thought of, and architected, right? Specifically, it takes rethinking the idea of persistent services organized through technical trust models. That the task before us is to build internet accessible services that can operate to manifest the promises of the internet while minimizing the harms that can be caused by usage. That examples of a new type of autonomous, decentralized, and asymmetric internet infrastructure can be seen being deployed in conflict zones. The examples that we have up here, some of which are well documented, some of which are not, but in Egypt, during the Tahrir Square demonstrations, the internet was cut off, right? I'm sure almost everyone heard about that, right? Like they cut the internet off completely, tried to shut down access to the network. And what some people did is they contacted a satellite internet provider in Malta, they got a connection, they bounced that connection to Libya, they mesh netted the connection all the way down the Libyan coast into Egypt and bounced the border, and then started handing out little dongles to receive connectivity and clients so people could connect to a mesh net. And that actually connected tens of thousands of people to the internet on this autonomously constructed mesh net that was built in like 48 hours, right? So these things are possible, right? Activists in the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong, right? When people were camped out in Hong Kong, used FireChat, which, you know, FireChat for better or worse, I mean, it's not open source necessarily. It's not the most secure thing ever. But what it did do was it allowed people to communicate peer-to-peer without using the actual lines owned by the Chinese government, right? And that allowed people to maintain communication. Then in Turkey, activists have built infrastructure to monitor internet shutdowns and throttling, right? They use like a simple JavaScript embed on websites to do this, as well as networks of redundant VPNs, which during the Gezi Square protests in Istanbul, they would spray paint the URL for the VPNs up on the walls, so people could go and actually pull down the certificates to connect to them. And the Google DNS. Right, so people could circumvent the DNS blocks, right? So these are like relatively simple approaches built on relatively simple technologies that are, you know, well known already, and people have been using them in these kind of crisis situations. That at a time in which surveillance is increasing, right, not just in the United States, but all over the world, and that's largely through technical capability, the legal limitations are becoming either ineffective or weakened, and in which net neutrality is under assault, it is ever more important that as a community we turn our eyes and skills towards this problem. That from the lessons of past attempts and the technical flaws of these attempts, we can learn the lessons that will facilitate us as a community contributing to making the promises of the internet a reality. So, but before getting into some of the things that can provide some of the baselines for this, right? And before getting into a sort of technical framework for thinking through these problems, we have to clarify what we're not talking about. So we're not talking about large-scale enterprise deployments which exist between thick walls, like behind thick walls of protection, right? That the requirements of such systems are completely out of the reach of most high-risk users. And most high-risk users find themselves in situations in which the construction and maintenance of such a system is completely outside of financial and technical capabilities, as well as existing in such a way as to be easily located, easily seized, right, easily taken down. That we're not talking about something that lives behind expensive firewalls, right? We're not talking about something that lives, in relation to expensive monitoring systems, right? The enterprise grade security mechanisms that many of us spend our days either building or circumventing, are incredibly complex and difficult to deploy, right? Anyone that's ever tried to roll ArcSight knows this, painfully, right? That the average user may have access to something like pfSense, right? How many people have played around pfSense? Yeah, pfSense is pretty awesome. They might have access to something like pfSense if they know someone who's a little bit more technical, and might know someone who can help configure it correctly, right? Use Snort in a way that's not going to block all your connection to the internet and all that. Some may even go as far as to deploy their own DNS servers, right? And network defense mechanisms at really small scale. But even in this case, all this provides is for the highly technical user, the ability to protect their own connection, right? And their own ability to connect to the internet, rather than the connections of other users or the security of their systems. That, as has been seen in repressive operations in the past, and as we constantly state when talking about OPSEC and ORGSEC, an entity is only as secure as its weakest link, right? In a lot of the cases in which organizations have been taken down, which people have gone to prison, it's been because one person got, their phone backdoored, or one person opened up the wrong email, or, some site wasn't secured the right way, or someone left an SSH key on GitHub, or something like that, right? It's always one little tiny flaw. And anyone here that works as a pen tester knows what one little tiny flaw can lead to, right? It's your beginning toehold into something much bigger. Then the absence of these mechanisms, static services that exist over time, right? These things that we try and build forever, and are centralized in their operation, become really easy targets for malicious actors, whether state level actors, surveillance companies, or like random script kiddies, right? So what are we talking about, right? We've gone through problematizing, we've gone through what we're not talking about. So what are we talking about here? That there have been a number of projects that have attempted to decentralize services, right? I think, how many people heard about Mastodon, right? Like there was Mastodon, right? What was the one before that? What? GNU Social, Diaspora, right? Like there are these systems that come up all the time, and like lots of devs like to talk about how they have the solution to decentralizing the internet and stuff like that. Like these populate GitHub, to an extreme degree. But many of these projects have been left for dead. Right? You go to these pages and no one's updated the code base in 3 years, right? There hasn't been an issue filed in 2 years, right? Even more are largely undocumented or involve really complex setup, right? So has anyone tried to go to something and been like, man, this is really cool. I really want to run this. And then you go to their like read the docs page and it's like 3 lines long and there's like absolutely no description of what to do, right? Many of these protocols require really well-provisioned machines, right? That you need a system with 16 gigs of RAM and a quad-core processor and stuff like that, right? 4 terabytes of storage and things like this. And a large number of these protocols are completely untested, right? Completely unaudited, an attempt to build something that's completely new, rather than relying on trusted, proven technologies that we can use as a baseline for something like this. Many of these protocols are often really difficult for clients to adopt, right? There's a lot of these protocols that exist out there that you can only interact with over a command line. Right? Which, I always call it the mom and dad test, right? If my mom and dad can't use it, or if they look at it and go, what is this? It's probably not the most effective solution I could come up with. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we build tools that are autonomous, right? So can be run by an individual person, don't require an entire collective or group or your techie friends or whatever to run, are secure, at least secure-ish, right? So things that will deal with some level of attempt at attacking them, right? They're not going to stand up to the NSA, right? They're not going to stand up to like persistent attack over 6 months, but they're secure-ish and they will have at least a limited time to live before they become completely compromised, right? And are relatively surveillance resistant. So this is a question of how do we allow clients to attach themselves to a service, right? Are we talking about plain text internet? Are they using VPNs to get into something? Do they have to connect to a mesh net first? Are they using Tor, right? Providing some level of anonymity to circumvent some level of surveillance is an achievable goal, right? We're talking about services that are deployable and usable by normal users that aren't security engineers, right? So we'll talk a little bit later about Tahoe LAFS, which is an absolutely awesome protocol. But the joke when I talked to the developer is I was like the 4th person he'd met that actually set one up because it's something that only security engineers do, right? Because it's a really complicated thing to set up. We're talking about things that can exist easily as temporary or ephemeral services. And we'll get into this in a little bit too, but in the absence of being able to build the castle with the big, tall, thick walls, being able to move and bounce the location of your infrastructure, though not a perfect defense, and though something that people in the InfoSec scene hate when we talk about obscurity, does potentially provide at least a minimal level of security. We're talking about things that can be deployed on cheap and free hardware, right? Cheap laptops you buy at a thrift store, desktops, Raspberry Pis, phones, things like this, like stuff that you can get for $50 or less, maybe $100, maybe $150 at the top limit. But things that you can get for, not a, super significant bank account breaking amount of dollars, right? And we're looking at systems that can leverage sysops and DevOps tools, right? Another thing that InfoSec people tend to not like is like DevOpsy stuff. And James will talk about DevOps stuff in a little bit, but DevOps makes spinning up things easy, right? SysOps tools like Ansible make spinning things up easy, right? Not necessarily in the most secure way, but they make the spinning up and running of the service easy. We're also looking for things that are very well documented, right? So don't start this process of writing a tool that you want people to use to secure their freedom and safety and then not write documentation for it, because that's what people do all the time. So people need to be able to use the thing, right? We're looking for projects that have to be open source, right? If anyone has, looked at Wire or anything like this, or any of these kind of proprietary, what's the one that was being used in the White House? Does anyone remember? The one that revealed some, what was it? No, it revealed only some of the message and then deleted it as you saw it, or I forgot what it was called, but it's a completely closed source technology, right? What? Twitter? Yeah. Yeah. But these are completely closed source technologies, right? We have no idea what they're actually doing, and we have no idea, we have no way to monitor the code base, right? We're looking for tools that are built through, and this is probably the most important point, built through a development process that involves engagement and listening to the users that we are trying to protect, right? We are not super great at that as a community, right? This idea that we're going to listen to people that we might perceive as not knowing what they're talking about. It's one of those, it's a process of getting out of our offices and actually talking to regular people that might not know what's going on. And this is the thing that a lot of users that I know that try and use these things complain about constantly. But we have to be willing to listen to the people that we're developing tools for. We have to develop tools that are adaptable to different sorts of threat models and deployment circumstances, right? That we tend to build these tools that are really good in a situation, right? But that aren't super flexible. And we want to build a tool that facilitates operation among existing physical, real networks of trust, right? Not synthetic networks of trust, not networks of trust that build through the use of a tool, right? Like Facebook, how many people here have Facebook and how many people have Facebook friends they don't actually know, right? No, raise your hand high, raise it proud, right? I mean, there's a lot of people, right? That is the whole point of Facebook, is that you have friends you don't actually know, right? So caution, there's dragons and pitfalls and stuff, right? And we have to keep this in mind. Again, we're not building NSA-proof systems here, right? We're building secure-ish systems that facilitate the promise of the internet. And that's a different thing. Though building systems like this, there are a lot of pitfalls. We're not going to have 100% uptime, right? If the person down the street's trying to run the chat server, they're not going to have 100% uptime. The chat server is going to go down, and if they're not paying attention to it because they're at work or something, it's just going to be down, right? We just have to be comfortable with that. We're going to be using consumer-grade gear a lot of the time for the tools like this. And what happens with consumer-grade gear? It breaks, right? We're not using fancy SAS drives, so they don't just run forever. They break and they die. Services are not going to be able to be, in most cases, tested for security vulnerabilities, right? On every deployment. Due to the resources of those deploying technologies, right? That the anonymity of users and the trust between the users and the service becomes super paramount here. But the ability to pen test every single instance of something is just completely impractical, and we have to be comfortable with that. So we have to spend a lot of time focusing on the protocols themselves. That there will be likely, in most circumstances, absolutely no mitigating controls, right? There's not going to be something that's going to be able to compensate for the fact that someone's trying to run SQL injection on your service, right? There's not going to be a WAF. There's not going to be real firewalls. Like in most of these circumstances, even being connected to the internet in a reliable way is like somewhat of a victory. That without an eye towards how to explain the system to non-technical users, the project will likely gain very little uptake, right? So if anyone's ever tried to read the documentation for a lot of these things, like I have a hard time understanding it a lot of the time. I've got to spend some time with it. I've got to read through it. If I'm trying to like train the women's rights group in the neighborhood how to do that and how to deploy something, and they don't even know the lingo, they don't understand the terms. They might have one or two people that are a little bit more technically inclined, right? Or like the tenants' rights organization or something like this. They're going to give up, right? And people give up on things like this all the time because the barrier to entry is so high. And we have to work on lowering the barriers to entry. That again, we have to develop these systems through a process of listening, which sometimes, again, we're not very good at as a community by and large. So some recent developments that help in this project, right? First, cheap hardware. So cheap hardware is abound. Like how many people have tried to go buy a laptop on eBay in the last like 6 months, right? It's relatively easy to find a laptop with like an i5 and 8 gigs of RAM for like $300 or less. Like that's totally a thing. Like you can buy servers on eBay for $150, right? And so the idea that you can have relatively well provisioned hardware is not insurmountable, but you're not going to have indefinite capacity. That with the increasing speed at which enterprise-grade gear is being released into the secondary market, with a dramatic increase in processing speed and power of consumer-grade gear, adequately provisioned equipment can be purchased at minimal cost, though we must still be conscious of the limitations of the hardware that high-risk users have access to, even though that calculus has changed, right? So it's no longer 10-year-old desktops and stuff like that. It's newer gear, it's more powerful gear, but it's still somewhat limited in its capacity. But it's not impossible to imagine, though, because of cheap gear and the proliferation of cheap gear. Decentralized networks built off cheap, headless desktop computers stashed in closets, Raspberry Pis, some $200 laptops, and a couple $150 servers, right? That's totally something that is able to be constructed at this point in time. And decentralized design makes the scaling kind of easy, or much easier than it used to be, of course, depending on the protocol. You want to jump up and talk about DevOps real quick?
Yeah. So another thing that has happened over the last 5 years, in particular, although the trend has been going on for the better part of a decade now, is tools like that enable us to deploy applications and infrastructure quickly. So how many people are familiar with like DevOps tools in some level? Okay, so there's a few. This is all the ones that I've used personally, and on that list, we've got things like Docker, which lets you do jails, and you can do deterministic deployments. So how difficult was it 5 years ago to do a build of your application in such a way that every time you ran it, if the code didn't change, you would get the exact same hash? That was incredibly difficult. With tools like Docker, now code's the same. I can run it on here, and I'll get one hash, and then you can run it over there, and you will get the exact same hash. So there's tools out there that are enabling more and more complicated infrastructure to be built. An example of this on the enterprise side that a lot of people do is, let's spin up load balancer and 5 web servers. That can take like 30 seconds. And when you're doing this on cheap hardware, here's the pre-made playbook for how to build this service, run this command, and it all fires up. And the accessibility of these is only getting better. Because most of them started off with the idea of ephemeral environments, right? Servers are cattle, they're not pets. When it gets owned, we get rid of it and we create a new one. And that's exactly what, going back, Vagrant, rebuild development environments. That's what it was created for, right? You mess it up, we just restart.
Okay, so what does this all equate to, right? So we've been talking about a lot of problems and some things that people have done, some conditions. What does this all equate to, right? It equates to a conceptual model, right? A way that we can start to think through this problem set that's slightly different than the way that we've been thinking about it so far, right? That the combination of cheap hardware / disposable hardware, so stuff that we could use and if it comes under threat, literally destroy, advances in encryption, increases in processing power, and the use of deployment technologies allow for the basis of a conceptual approach to be crafted that begins to work through this problem. That by using cheap hardware, the high-risk user is able to destroy nodes and clients pretty much whenever they need to, right? But this was one of those things that was really important in Syria when Syrian dissidents talk about their use of computers, right? That if they were using Facebook and the government was storming into their apartment building, there was an approach that people started picking up of like trying to think through that problem beforehand so they could pick up their computer and throw it out the window, right? And we're literally thinking about something that exists in the same way, but not necessarily destroying the hardware, but destroying the service, destroying any trace of the service, right? Just eliminating it from actual physical storage. The use of deployment technologies allows for an ease of deployment and redeployment, right? And that creates a process in which we can change where services are deployed. We can spin them up and we can tear them down and we can move those very quickly. That this equates to the building blocks of ephemeral, asymmetric technical infrastructure or infrastructure that can be deployed, torn down, and redeployed very easily, right? If we think about this within theories of modern warfare, for example, right? And use that same sort of framework. When forces that exist at a disadvantage can't defend themselves, what do? They move, right? They move around, they change location, they change their operational modes, right? And that's a problem set that we're just beginning to start to approach here. That though this does not eliminate the problem of compromise at all, right? That these aren't, again, bulletproof services. By limiting knowledge of service to trusted circles, embedding the service in hidden networks, and limiting the life cycle of the service as much as possible, the service becomes a much more difficult target to discover and compromise, right? I don't know if anyone's tried to do network pen tests on a network where things change all the time. You'll see this in like capture the flag VMs sometimes, like the services will change or they'll change ports or something like that. It makes it significantly harder to even pinpoint what you're even looking at. Some technologies that exist currently utilize similar concepts, right? But have certain kinds of weaknesses, but contain lessons that we can learn in the development of these things. The first is CJDNS. Like, is anyone here familiar with CJDNS? Cool. CJDNS is awesome. It's a mesh netting protocol, right? It allows the construction of either localized or remote and distributed mesh networks, right? So construct a network where systems within that network can connect to each other and serve services to each other, which are not discoverable from outside of that network, right? What's interesting about CJDNS and what holds promise in CJDNS is the way that nodes get added to the network. So it's not that anyone could just go, oh, hey, this is cool, I'm going to get added to the network. But if anyone's ever done research on like Hyperborea is probably the largest CJDNS network that exists right now, you need to be trusted by a node that already exists to be let into the network. And what that does is it builds a model which, depending on implementation, becomes one based on interpersonal already existing trust that's then facilitated through a technical model. It also becomes incredibly easy to get rid of nodes if you need to, right? And so this constructs a sort of parallel network that we can start to serve services through. Tahoe LAFS. Tahoe LAFS is like probably my favorite project that exists right now. What it is it's a distributed file storage system, which doesn't sound super exciting until you like get into what it does. So if you have access to the system, which means that you need to know where the system is, you need credentials to get access to it and so on, and you upload a file. When you upload that file will copy itself a set number of times, right? Which is set in configuration. You can set it at 3, you can set it at 600, whatever. Copies itself a set number of times, then encrypts itself, cuts itself up, and distributes pieces and parts of itself all over a distributed storage network that you've set up. And that storage network can include any node that has literally any storage capacity. So that could be a phone. That could be a Raspberry Pi. It could be, you know, the desktop that you bought for college that's been sitting in your parents' garage for the last 10 years. Like, whatever. It could be anything that actually has any storage capacity. What's interesting about it is that files aren't apparent. So you can't just like go to a Tahoe node, hack the node, and then find all the files, right? That you have to know what's called a furl, so you get an address for the file that needs to be sent to you to be able to actually retrieve the file. But the coolest part of Tahoe and why it's useful in this situation is that if any one storage node is seized or taken, you can't recover the entirety of a single file, right? Even if you knew how to decrypt the file, which in itself is relatively difficult because they're encrypted with AES, even if you could do that, you still wouldn't have the entirety of one file. You'd have to decrypt every single little tiny portion of every file and then kind of guess at how they go back together, right? And you configure it in such a way so that a percentage of your storage nodes can be taken down, but you can still retrieve the file back, right? So you can set that at 80%. You could lose 80% of your nodes simultaneously at once and still be able to get your files back, right? So this is starting to be deployed in like corporate contexts because it provides redundancy and resiliency, but it's specifically useful in this kind of a circumstance. The problem is that it is like insanely difficult to run, like insanely difficult to run and set up and manage at this current time, although there's a lot of work being done to kind of remedy that. IPFS. So has anyone ever tried to use IPFS? Cool. Yeah, I was messing around with it like last couple months. It's pretty interesting. So, outside of the kind of like funny name, right? IPFS stands for the Interplanetary File System. And there's like a mythology around it built by the devs about how this is going to be the way they get files to Mars and like stuff like that. And there's like a very strange discourse around this protocol. But what's really interesting about the protocol is you sort of get on the network, right? And you form connections with other nodes within the network and you start backing up their files. And once you back up their files, you can have access to those things, right? But within this, what's interesting is it does version control, right? So you kind of pull a file in, but if it's different than the hash of the file that you pulled down like 30 seconds ago, you know the difference, right? And so you end up with this ability to build forward and roll back in a decentralized network, which didn't exist really before IPFS in any way that was like widely available. Magic Wormhole. Like Magic Wormhole is something like almost... Has anyone ever played with it? Like we were playing around with it. Magic Wormhole is a much smaller project done by the people who wrote Tahoe LAFS. And what it is you'll like download it, like you download it through pip, right? Python package index. You download it through pip, and you run it literally by typing in wormhole send file name, and it seems totally unremarkable, right? But what it does is really cool. It encrypts your file client side and gives you a 3-word passcode, sends it up through a server, right? And then someone else goes wormhole receive, and then the passcode, and then it pulls the file down and decrypts it for you. What's great about Magic Wormhole is it will run on literally anything that can run Python. It is so small and so limited in the amount of power it takes to run. And it's so incredibly simple, but it provides a very easy way to transfer files peer-to-peer that has at least a minimal level of security and is inherently ephemeral, right? Doesn't exist for any period of time. So, okay, we're going to move on to the obligatory tool release, right? Pretty much when like I've given a talk, and I know a lot of people I know have given talks, we usually drop some sort of like tool. In this case, it's a Python script. So we wrote this tool that we're calling GhostServe. It was written in Python 3. And what it does, there's the Git address if anyone wants to take a look at it. It's a proof of concept script, right? So this is not something you should be running in a life or death situation. Merely what we're trying to do is sort of prove out an idea, okay? So the script leverages ephemeral Tor hidden services to run services which are spun up and torn down through a simple command line interface. So like literally after you run the install script, which downloads everything, pulls everything down, configures your Tor configuration file, all of this stuff, you're literally running Python 3 ghostserve.py tac I to spin up a Tor hidden service IRC, and then hitting enter to kill it. What's interesting about ephemeral hidden services, and ephemeral hidden services are sort of a newer thing within the Tor protocol. What's interesting about ephemeral hidden services is unlike traditional hidden services, which are essentially just websites or web services that you have accessible through some port and get stored on disk like anything else, ephemeral hidden services run entirely in memory, which is really cool. So they're a little bit more difficult to configure, which is hence why we wrote the script to do it. But you spin them up. The script kicks you out a nice little .env address. You tell people what that is. Then when you hit enter, it tears it down. And as it tears it down, it's gone. And there's nothing left. Like if you store something persistently, like through a file share, that's still there. But the service and any history of the service, logs, anything are gone completely. It's one of these protocols that the Tor project has really been playing around with more and more and more and more and more, but it hasn't really picked up a lot of adoption simply because it is relatively difficult to do, right? So again, proof of concept, right? Don't go to, you know, Turkey and try and run this to circumvent government surveillance. I mean, you might be successful, but I'm not going to like guarantee anything. So our task. The information security community often discusses our social responsibility, right? This is like a large part of our discourse internally. And why a lot of us got involved, I know is part of the reason I got involved in learning these things, was a sense of social responsibility. And many of us contribute to technical projects, right, that manifest the idea of what this means to us, right? We all have different ideas of what social responsibility is. But most of the time, these interventions are confined to the technical realm, right? To research that results in technical solutions that, though super important and that form the basis for the things that we're talking about in this talk, very rarely ever leave technical space, right? That tools are often developed which are technically sound but difficult for users to implement. But to be able to manifest our social responsibility, it's necessary to kind of leave the screens, right? Leave the offices, leave the basements, and enter into a world which is unplugged and in a lot of ways a lot more complicated than the nice technical worlds that we surround ourselves with all the time, right? Like, you go look at a web app and it's a machine. It's an abstract machine, but it operates in a certain way, and you can pretty much figure out what that is even without looking at the code, and all of that's simple. And the importance of that is clear in the abstract, right? But the material world and the problems people deal with are much more complicated than the technical problems that we look at every day, and the solutions are much less direct, right? And that's a difficult space for us to start to interact with. But it's a necessary thing. That by grappling with the question of security for users in an increasingly treacherous, centralized online space, we can serve that profound social purpose. And we can help to manifest the vision of the internet, which has formed the foundation for first the hacker scene and then the information security industry for the last 25 years, right? That assisting in decentralization is one of many ways we can contribute, right? I know people around here are circulating that do GiveCamp, right? Helping nonprofits do security. There's, you know, you could teach your parents how to use encryption. There's a lot of ways to contribute. This is one way that we can actually start to manifest that vision. So if anyone has questions or tomatoes to throw or whatever, you can't really read that. It's contact@digitalfreedominitiative.org. I've got cards and stuff if people want them. But yeah, does anybody have any questions? Yeah, shoot.
Are there any thoughts, or I know some pretty unrelated thoughts, but like fight the info wars and all this false fake media, like how do other than keeping our heads out of all those streams of crap, what can we do as, you know, security leaders and maybe digitally responsible to help promote good social interaction on the internet and fight all the fake crap out there?
That's a question that might even be too big to even deal with right here. It's hard because part of the promise of the internet is anonymity, right? But sure, yes, right. So we can demand more stringent requirements when people are making random claims, right? That doesn't mean that's actually going to take hold, right? I think one of the things to keep in mind, and this has been talked about since, you know, the American and French revolutions, is freedom is a complicated thing. And it means that things are going to happen that we don't necessarily like, and that it's our responsibility to try and fight back and do something about that, but that there's really no singular answer, I don't think. It's a hard question. It's a very hard question. And I think it takes a lot more conversation than we have probably right now. Paul, do you have a question?
I assume everybody like sort of here is kind of interested in internet privacy and these kind of projects, but you know, again, everybody here, like 90% of everybody white male, North America. My question is sort of ethically, how do we approach people that we work with? Like, I don't give a shit. I'm getting paid a lot of money. Like, I know security, but I don't give a shit about somebody in the third world. You know, like ethical question. Like, how do you convince people that aren't like totally sold on this? That, you know, even though I have nothing to hide, I need to support these initiatives for people that are in, you know, developing countries with oppressive regimes, they do have something that, the interests of a free society require that they, hide what they're doing or whatnot.
Yeah. Part of me wants to say, don't know if we have to convince everybody, right? No, and I'm serious about that. Like, there are going to be a lot of people that, for whatever reason, don't think this is important. And we're not going to, nor do I think we have to, convince everyone of this. What we have to do is we have to develop enough momentum to overcome the apathy and the indifference and the attempts to move against this sort of attempt, right? That it is a question just like any other sort of social and political question. It's always a question of inertias, right? It's a question of not necessarily even support, because support doesn't really mean much. But it is a question of being able to intervene, right, directly in the situation. I think for a long time, we were asking politicians and, the public to sort of engage in this discourse. And we're watching right now with net neutrality, even though we won the argument, right, it doesn't actually matter, right? So that requires a different approach now. It doesn't mean we shouldn't engage in that kind of, that form of engagement, right? But it does require now that we have to actually do things that are a little bit more direct. And I think that that's an important thing, right? We have to start thinking about this on the level of action, not expression, right? And I'm starting to see that happen more and more and more all the time. Right? A lot of people here are thinking along those lines. I think that's really helpful. Yeah, that's what I would say. I don't know if it's a necessary thing. Yeah.
If I can add to that, it's not just people who are in third world countries or oppressive regimes. It's happening here in the U.S. as well. There's the women's shelter that needs that type of help. It doesn't have to be building the types of tools that we're talking about, ephemeral, hidden, etc. It can be something as simple as just helping with basic digital literacy and whatnot. There's involvement is a target, right? And you can be on the outer edge, and you can also go ever in closer to the bullseye. And not everybody has to be there. Frankly, there's not a whole lot of room there. But everybody can be involved and can help in some way.
Like security awareness type activities probably be the most effective. Because like you brought up if your threat vector is like the federal government, there really isn't anything you can do. But like if it's the tenants' rights organization, security awareness, hey, I should use Signal instead of Snapchat, or I should demand like Facebook private chat or WhatsApp. Would not be something like the EFF to follow, or even you mentioned like Amnesty or the ACLU can't even afford an MSSP. Maybe that's something even for the larger organizations like EFF MSSP or something.
Yeah, and so security training has, I think it's fallen into kind of two different models, right? There's two very different models. We have the security self-defense guide kind of model that the EFF puts out, right? We have a postcard here that our organization's handing out about 5 things you can do to make your privacy and security better, right? Like patch your system, use a VPN. There's very general advice that we give. However, in a lot of situations, that general advice isn't good enough, right? When you're dealing with a tenants' rights organization or a trade union or something like that has a very specific sort of threat that they're dealing with, we have to engage in a much more persistent way. I mean, that involves conversations and listening and figuring out what they're dealing with and actually putting together material for them, right? Following up, doing the kinds of things that how many of us do that kind of work at work every day, right? I do. How many of the rest of you do? We know how to do these things. We're very good at it. In fact, we're incredibly good at it. We have to take the same approaches that we use when we're a pen tester talking to a dev team, right? Or we're trying to do phishing training for our employees, right? You work at a bank or something, you're like, cool, why are people going to want to break in? Well, they're going to want to break in to get to the system that routes the money, right? That's a little bit different than they're going to break into ransomware you, right? But we think through these questions all the time. I think that's the important thing. We're dealing with user education. It is an issue of capacities, right? We don't have the time or bandwidth to train everybody. And I think that that's a legitimate thing to recognize. But when we do engage with somebody, when we do engage with an organization, we can actually take the time to sit there and figure out what do they need, what are they facing, what are the capabilities of the people in the organization, and how can we help then, right? Think about it like we would as a consultancy. Think about it like we would, like we do at work, right? I think we have models for these things, right? And that's why I think that this community of people above others can actually do really important things in the world when it comes to things like protecting grassroots organizations and things like this, because we know how to do this already. We're actually very good at it.